the teacher was telling us that animals don't have souls. And that was the moment that I realized that I really do have these kind of strong views, and that isn't something that I would be willing to concede on. And so, because I had a dog at the time, and I could see that she was just as full and complex of a being as I was.
Our participants actually admit to sort of fallacies in their thinking, where they admit that some of the beliefs that they hold are more so that they want to believe this, right? They are aware of the incongruencies. They are aware that fish are probably not super dumb, that fish can perceive pain.
Thinking about epistemology, like who is knowledge created for? Who does the knowledges that we create, who does it exclude? What are the injustices that our knowledge creation processes, systemically perpetuate?
Good afternoon. How are you?
Hi, nice to see you, Jamie. How are you?
Yeah, really good, really good. Well, it's lovely to talk to all three of you. I was just saying I'm a bit intimidated by trying to interview three people at once, so I'm going to see how it goes, but I'm sure you'll be gentle with me. But it's wonderful to get the chance to talk to you. And I've been fascinated partly by your research about relevant topics for this podcast series, the cheese paradox and the pescetarian paradox, although that wasn't really the name of the paper. So it'll be really interesting to dig into some of the research that you've done together. But I guess the trigger for our original conversation was that Carol and I were brought together by one of our favorite Twitter trolls, which is nice to have a silver lining from a rather unpleasant situation. So yeah, it's wonderful to get the chance to talk to you all. And you know this already, but I guess it's a series of conversations about what I think of as the deepest philosophical questions, and the ones that unfortunately most of humanity still get wrong. And they're questions of how do we best understand this crazy reality we all share, the questions of epistemology, which you might summarize as the sort of what's real question, and also, just as importantly, the deep questions of ethics, what matters and who matters, and how can we lead a good life. And what might the answers to those questions, what the implications might the answers we give have for how we might make a better world together. And I have an obvious bias because I'm trying to develop and popularize this really pluralistic worldview called Sentientism. And it answers the what's real question by saying, let's use evidence and reason. Let's try and engage honestly with reality in an attempt, hopefully a humble attempt to understand it. And on the ethics question, the clue is in the name. It suggests that whatever type of ethics we want to apply, every sentient being, any being that can have experiences, that can suffer, that can flourish, that can feel, should count seriously in our moral considerations. But I'm talking to people in this series of conversations whether they agree or not. So it'll be fascinating to just understand your own philosophical journeys, how that plays into some of the work you do now, and how you think about the better future we might all make. But I should stop rambling on and give you all a chance to introduce yourselves. So if you want to say a few words about who you are and what you do. And I don't know if, Devon, you wanted to start first, just to randomly pick an order.
Sure. So hi, I'm Devon. I studied human-animal interactions for my master's at Stirling Uni, although I've been interested in human-animal interactions my whole life, really. But that's really when I got into it in a kind of academic level. And now I work as a teaching assistant at Stirling University in the psychology department. And I also create some animal advocacy content online as well. So I've got a nice foot in both camps, kind of between the academic side and the advocacy side of helping animals.
That's great. Thank you. And I've discussed that with quite a few of my guests, that this is one of those topics where it seems quite hard to just stay in academia. There's such an imperative to have an impact on the world as well. So yeah, it's great to have that activism as well as the academic side too. Thank you. Maja, how about you?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Maja Cullen. I did my undergrad in psychology and then my postgrad in clinical health psychology. And along with that, I was also a research assistant working with women who have breast lymphedema following breast-conserving cancer surgery. And I've also always worked with kids and adults who have additional support needs, which really taught me a lot about what it means to be human and just human interactions and what communication is. And then most recently, we published our paper, Out of Sight, Out of Mind, How Pescetarians Manage Dissonance by Creating Distance, which is a bit of a mouthful. Maybe we need to work on the title, come up with something more pithy. But yeah, I was the primary researcher on that. So yeah, bringing my personal passions and beliefs also into the work that I'm doing.
Oh, and we'll dig into that later on. And Carol, to finish the triplet.
So I'm a lecturer at Stirling University. I teach social psychology and I also teach qualitative research methods. And actually quite a lot of the qualitative research methods teaching that I do is very much about reality and knowledge. And I'm really trying to get across to students often the idea that science doesn't have to be about numbers. It doesn't have to be about evaluating and measuring. And actually a lot of, especially in psychology, if we want to understand people, then I think we need to do that with words. We need to listen to their experiences. We need to allow them opportunities to give us their own narratives, and for us to understand those in light of our own subjective experiences, because we all have a position, we all have positionality, and trying to get across to students that science can be stories. It doesn't have to be this, numerical, very hard paradigm. And actually for some of our students, that's really transformative. They've never thought about that. The science teaching so often is based entirely in sort of pseudo-objectivity, and learning that subjectivity can be really powerful and it can really help us to understand people and to have transparency in our work, I think is a really important part of my teaching in social psychology, which is so much about inequality in the module that I teach. And then that idea of developing knowledge systems and thinking about who creates knowledge and who it's created for. So that's kind of my sort of broad background.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. And it's a perfect segue into our first deep philosophical epistemological question too.
Yeah.
So this what's real question is so broad because it can cover the entire of human thought and knowledge, but quite often an interesting way into it is to ask my guests how they grew up and whether that was in more of a religious or a spiritual or a supernatural sort of context, family and society, belief systems and ways of thinking, or one that was maybe more naturalistic or more scientifically minded, maybe atheistic, agnostic, just because that's one of the big questions in epistemology is how to think about the religion and the supernatural, and to explore how that's changed through their lives and how you think today about those deep questions of the best ways of understanding this crazy universe we all share. So I don't know if you want to switch the order, and Carol, I don't know if you wanted to kick off first and tell your sort of philosophical story. It's up to you how deep back into your personal past you want to go.
So I grew up in a religious household. I grew up in a Presbyterian family. My dad was a church elder, and my mum sang in the choir. My sister and I went to Sunday school, and even as a young teenager, I was quite interested in religion. And then as I got older, I started to learn more and explore more outside the realm of your own family experience. I became quite interested in Celtic mythology. And when I discovered that most of our Christian festivals map almost directly onto the existing Celtic or pagan festivals, I started to that was my kind of epiphany moment that religion and what we think of as sort of typical Protestant, anyway, Christianity in the UK and Scotland is based very much on, or coincides, should I say, or aligns with these pagan principles. And that really switched for me how I think about spirituality. And I'd had quite a few doubts for a while about what I really believed. And I had quite a lot of conversations with my parents about it. And actually their beliefs have really changed over time too, which is quite surprising. So as a family, we've all kind of evolved, I think, our thinking. But my dad, I remember having I've always asked lots of questions. I remember trying to talk to my dad about the Bible. And I've read the Bible several times. I've read several different versions of the Bible. I think it's a really beautiful book, especially the King James version. I really enjoyed it. And I remember saying to my dad, like when I was young, but how can the Old Testament, like how can this be real? Like this doesn't make sense. And he said that, and this was probably the start of me unraveling things, he said that the Old Testament is a way that people use to understand the world around them and, I suppose, construct their own reality in the absence of other explanations. And I thought, the more I started to think about that, and I realized it was contextual, like the Old Testament largely is stories that people told themselves to understand the world. And I guess now in my work currently, we sort of trying to develop lots of ideas of using stories to help people construct their own reality. So I guess what I'm doing now in a scientific domain is exactly what was being done by people, you know, in the time of the Old Testament, like, you know, centuries ago. So yeah, I think there's a sort of nice rhythm to all of that. I don't think my beliefs now are completely different. I think the focus is just sort of shifted.
Yeah. So it sounds like you maybe have retained some sort of sense of the transcendent or the spiritual.
Yeah.
Even though you shifted from a Christian belief set to one that is maybe more paganistic and more open about what the nature of that might be, but there is still a sense that there is something supernatural or transcendent or something out there. Is that fair to say? Or
yeah, I think it's really arrogant to assume that we know everything. I think I'd be really hesitant to ever say that we have all the answers. I mean, I know, you know, a bit about the human brain. And I mean, for all I know about the human brain, a lot of it's about all the stuff we don't know about the human brain. We don't really fully understand consciousness, for example. I mean, we have lots of really great research and so on, but I mean, we still can't really get our finger exactly on what is consciousness. So, you know, I grapple with this idea that our complexity is all just on and off. It's all just binary, you know, series of binary decisions. And, you know, I guess maybe I want to believe there's a ghost in that machine, although I know there isn't. I like to retain that idea of not knowing everything. And I think in Celtic mythology, there's lots about ephemerality and, you know, there's just this nice sort of confluence of things which are ephemeral and things which are present and very tangible, and they're sort of intertwined together, both of them. And I think that's how I see the world, actually. I think I very much believe in concrete, real, but also I like to think that there's things we don't know and understand yet, and that maybe we're yet to discover. I think we should always be trying to find out more, I think.
Yeah, thank you. And I really like that approach, because I think a good naturalistic approach doesn't pretend to have all the answers. I think as soon as you pretend you've got all the answers, you're not taking a naturalistic approach, really. It's become another form of dogma. So I think that open-mindedness and that doubt and that willingness to say, I don't know, and there are some things we may never know, is entirely healthy. And I'd include that as a direct part of a sort of naturalistic worldview. And personally, I'm quite sort of boring, straight down the line naturalistic person, because my naturalistic epistemology, you know, using evidence and reason to understand the world, has led me to a pretty high degree of confidence, but not 100%, that the natural world is all that exists, and there is no ghost in the machine, and there's no spirits or souls or magic or mystical stuff. But that still leaves an enormous space where we don't know the answers, and it leaves an enormous space for awe and wonder and, you know, a sense of the transcendent without any magic. Whereas I think other people really enjoy that feeling of open-mindedness, of uncertainty, and they want that humility, but they also have this sense, emotional or intellectual, that there is something beyond the natural world that maybe addresses that gap, in some sense, that ghost in the machine you were talking about as well.
Yeah, and maybe it's just like human energy. I mean, to some extent, or, you know, the energy that, you know, we create, physical energies in the world. I mean, maybe that's all, and that is still a part of the natural world, right? Maybe that's all it is. Maybe it's just energy systems. But yeah, I like to think that there's something beyond us. Maybe it's because we get everything as a society, we get so many things wrong. Maybe I just kind of hope there's some other sort of explanation, and maybe there's some hope that they can come and help us get everything right. Maybe it's just rooted in hope for the world.
I tell you what, it's really complex being a human sometimes, because it's just, you've got all this stuff in your head and nothing really makes sense. And yeah, it's a hard thing to try and figure out, but I think you're doing a good job.
Thank you.
I like it.
For me so far.
Yeah. Well, do you want to go next, Devon? What's your sort of journey on that front so far?
Well, I grew up in a Catholic family. I went to Catholic primary school, Catholic high school, but religion never really resonated with me. It never really landed, and maybe part of the reason for that is because my parents, my grandparents were very religious, but my parents were kind of starting to fall away from the church by the time that I was quite young. But certainly in school, we always had that kind of very strict Catholic teaching. But I've never really thought about epistemology in great detail before. But I do remember, I think one of the most kind of transformative experiences, or the memory that I have, that I sort of really made that break away from, I suppose, religious teachings, was in a religion class. And I kind of accepted and went along with all the teachings and said, yeah, maybe. It just didn't engage me much, but I didn't feel strongly one way or the other. I was still very open-minded about it. But then it came upon this point about animals, and the teacher was telling us that animals don't have souls. And that was the moment that I realised that I really do have these kind of strong views, and that isn't something that I would be willing to concede on. And so we had a bit of a battle back and forth between that. And I was like, well, why not? And she said, well, because we're just made different. And I was like, why? Because I had a dog at the time, and I could see that she was just as full and complex of a being as I was. So it really struck me then that, oh, this is really not something that I can go along with here. So yeah, really started to diverge from a religious view at that age and just kind of do my own thing. But epistemology is still to this day something that I really struggle to get my head around. Like, it was first introduced when I was Carol's student, and I just thought, oh, here we go, because I just find it all so complex. And I think this
Are
is
you saying I didn't teach it very well?
No, you did. I think I don't know if this is a bit deep or dark, but there might be an aspect of, I'm pretty terrified of death. Like, I can't get my head around it. And so I don't know if that factors into how we can know what we can know. And it's all a bit too much for me. But so I kind of take more of an approach just centered on morality. Like, that's kind of my thing, rather than anything kind of outside of the realm of what we can see and how we can treat other people. That's really where my focus is.
Yeah, thank you. And it's interesting because we touched on one of the things I find fascinating about religion, because I was brought up Christian originally, and I guess became an atheist, or again with a pretty high credence an atheist. I'd never say 100% as a teenager. But one of the things I find fascinating about is the psychological motivations for religious belief. And we've touched on some of them already. One is, a fear of uncertainty, right? I just don't know. So it's quite reassuring to come up with an answer. One is, as you said, fear of death. And, it's very difficult psychologically to imagine us not existing, because we are the center of everything, right, for us. So it's quite hard. And sometimes when I'm talking schools, even with young kids, I'll get asked that question, and I'll say, well, do you remember what it was like before you were born? And they'll go, well, no. And I'm like, well, I think death is just like that. And occasionally I've had a couple of kids put their hand up and go, yeah, I remember, and which throws me off sometimes. But yeah, it's quite interesting how these psychological themes feed in. And you, Carol, you mentioned another one, which is this sense of maybe there's just a hope that there is something out there that's going to help fix stuff, or maybe there is. Hopefully, someone's got a plan. Wouldn't it be reassuring if they do? Yeah. So those psychological drives are quite interesting. But it's interesting you moved away from it because of that connection with the animal topic. So
yeah, that's very much where I come in. Just really strong connection with animals, and I really couldn't understand that. And then obviously I got to learn more and more about the Catholic Church and realised how much I disagree with it. But each to their own.
Yeah. And that's one of the themes in these conversations. I've had many guests who still have a religious worldview, others who've started out with a religious worldview and become sort of spiritual but not religious, others who, like me, have just sort of gone down straight down the line, naturalistic. I'm pretty confident there is no deity or magic or spiritual stuff. But it does seem that the things that have driven people are sometimes evidence and reason type stuff. So they're like, okay, the Noah floods or the resurrection or whatever it was. There's just things like, or same in Islam or Zoroastrianism or anything else, we're like, hold on, this just doesn't hold together. The evidence doesn't seem strong here. It seems more like these are deities made up by humans rather than deities making humans. But then there's also the theme of the moral stuff as well, like you were talking about, where it might be to do with non-human animals, it might be to do with sexism or homophobia or some other form of discrimination, or the idea that a perfect instantiation of the good would send innocents to hell. It's like, hold on, this is some like ethical challenges here. And that can be one of the ways where people move away from an established religion, but still retain a broader spirituality, because they reject the sort of institutional ethics, but they still want this sort of transcendent sense of this being something beyond. So I should stop rambling again. How about you, Maja? What's your story been on this front?
The ramble away, Jamie, is so interesting. Yeah, we've never really had in-depth conversations about our upbringing, so it's actually really interesting to hear that there's a lot of similarities there. So I grew up in Germany for all of my life until I moved to Scotland when I was 19. And I always perceived Germany to be less of a secular state than Scotland, for example. Like the nurseries, the high schools, the hospitals are still very much affiliated to the church. So it would be rare, at least when I grew up, that you would meet someone who wasn't christened. And I went to a Protestant primary school. I went to a Catholic high school. We still had nuns walking about the place. We had a church building that we would have to attend every month at least. And my family, they weren't excessively religious, I wouldn't say. I think they just kind of went along with the status quo, and they thought that religion was something that I benefited from. So they would send me to Catholic summer camps and things like that. And I really enjoyed it at the time. So when I was 11 or 12, I think I had a time where I wanted to be religious, because I saw how much strength and sort of purpose religious people could get out of their religion, which I still think is a beautiful and admirable thing. So I tried reading the Bible, I tried praying, and it just didn't feel authentic to me. It didn't feel right to me. And similar to Devon, I was already vegetarian at the time when I was 11, 12. So the whole thing about being a devoted Christian, but eating animals, that didn't sit right with me. That wasn't really congruent. So then when I was 13, I proudly declared to my religion teacher, who was a priest, that I'm an atheist. And no, he actually took that really well. He was lovely. He took that really well. Yeah.
Wow.
No, he was very respectful, and we had very interesting conversations. And yeah, since then, I think I'm just a person, my brain works very logically, at least in my perspective. Probably everyone thinks that, but I probably agree with you that I'm more of a naturalistic kind of person. But at the same time, like Carol said, I'm not trying to be arrogant. This is just my worldview. I'm not saying that I know more than anybody else. I think that's why we developed our paper as well, as far as ontology and epistemology goes, from like a relative social constructionist point of view, because we all have the human lens on, and my reality is very different to somebody else's reality. Doesn't make it more or less valid. But for myself, definitely the naturalistic sort of stance is what I can most align myself with.
Yeah, thank you. And I find it quite interesting that there's at least two different ways people you can use the term naturalism. One is about the ontology, which you talk about in that paper too, which is about, is the natural world all that exists, or is there supernatural stuff? Whereas the epistemology is more, to my mind, is more about the toolkit and the approach you use. And so I think you can have a naturalistic epistemology that's committed to believing and having credences grounded in evidence and reason, but still leave some space for supernatural stuff, possibly. I mean, I don't leave much space for them, but I think you can. But I guess the reason sometimes people will talk to me about the sentientism worldview and say, well, look, why do you include the naturalism stuff? Why isn't what really matters just the morality thing, right? The sentiocentric compassion and caring about all sentient beings. As long as we do that's surely enough. And I guess part of the reason I do want to include a naturalistic approach is because, one, I think that using evidence and reason is probably our best bet at understanding reality. It does not guarantee we'll be right, because we're flawed humans, and as we all know, right? But at least it seems like it's a better shot than the alternatives, which can include revelation or faith or dogmas that don't change if the evidence does. So as a toolkit, it seems to me just give us a best shot at understanding reality. Knowing we'll always be wrong. We always need to try and improve and be open-minded. But that's partly driven by a moral drive as well, which is if we want to make reality better, we'd probably better understand it. So having a naturalistic approach is important. But I guess the negative reason is that, and we'll come on to this in the next section, is that it strikes me that people with even a really rich, deep moral sense, what you might call in a trite way, good people, nice people, kind, caring, compassionate people, can still end up doing terrible things and saying terrible things if they're very wrong about reality. So, the example you talked about before, where if you think that for a being to matter morally, they have to have a soul, and you think that only humans have souls, so like Descartes, you think a dog cannot physically experience pain. It's just instinct that makes it squeal as you do vivisection on it. Right? In a way, that's not a moral error. That's an epistemological error. And that's one of the things I'd love to drill into in your research as well, because it strikes me in the non-human animal space that often the problem when I talk to people is as much about broken epistemology and people just having wrong understandings of reality as it is about a deliberate decision to exclude some beings from moral consideration. It's quite rare to find someone say, look, I just don't give a shit. It's more common for people to say, oh no, I care, right? I agree, but, and then here's this long list of factually ungrounded things where it's just taken them away. But that's one of the things I was really interested in touching on with you in this section, because Karen and I have had a few chats about where some of those things can go wrong, in the popular discourse, whether it's conspiracism, misinformation, disinformation, trolls, wellness gurus selling supplements. There's so many different things going on that have existed throughout history, but certainly seem very lively today, at least on Twitter. And to my mind, a lot of those things are driven by failures of epistemology too, because it feels like the people's beliefs have come ungrounded from the reality that exists. But at the same time, in your paper, you were quite clear that in your thinking, as you said, you were focusing on a relativistic approach that says, in a way, there is no ultimate grounding, perfect reality. People ultimately have their own realities in their heads, and a social constructivist epistemology that says that people create those things in their heads, those beliefs in their heads, through social interactions. So I guess here's the paradox I'd love to explore with you. I think that approach is extremely powerful when we're thinking about human psychology, because we're not trying to understand reality out there. We're trying to understand how individuals perceive reality in there. And in that sense, you have to go into their mind and understand, not whether they're right or wrong, but how they perceive reality. But at the same time, to my mind, we've got to find a way of anchoring that to the reality that I think actually is out there. Again, I'm not 100% sure. I could be a brain in a vat, but I'm highly confident that we do all live in one universe, and there are certain facts that we could come to agree on, and that you and I are on a Zoom call at the moment, and we're all human beings, and it's that if the subjective becomes detached from reality, that's when some of those terrible things can happen. How do you resolve the tension there between a generous understanding of someone's subjective reality without losing a mooring with a shared reality that could lead someone to deeply crazy and sometimes dangerous beliefs if they become unmoored?
That is such an interesting question. For us, I think in our paper, Out of Sight, Out of Mind, which is the fish paper, the fish paradox, as you like to call it, and I think we briefly called it that as well, but decided to change the name in the end. So like you said, we wanted to give our participants the opportunity to really speak on their experience and how they perceive marine animals. And perceive is probably the word that we used most throughout our paper. I'm sure it pops up about 1 million times. But then obviously turning that into more academic research and trying to find, like what you said, the more reality grounded sort of stance. We did a little bit probe that in the participants. And there's a wee section that we've got in our paper as well, where our participants actually admit to sort of fallacies in their thinking, where they admit that some of the beliefs that they hold are more so that they want to believe this, right? They are aware of the incongruencies. They are aware that fish are probably not super dumb, that fish can perceive pain. And I think we tried to supplement that with factual research out there, try and get as much evidence or as close to evidence as we could get. And that's how we tried to bring it together.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
No,
But
it does. Yeah.
Carol will probably have more experience in those regards.
I think one thing I always sort of say to students in particular, and anyone really when I'm talking about our research or the sorts of research we do, is that we have to be really careful that we don't go beyond the data that we have. So all we're ever going to have is what people choose to give us. We're never going to have any access to anyone's inner life world. We're never going to be able to make any claims to truth or validity because we never really know if our participants are sharing their true beliefs or not. So, and actually it doesn't matter because we work with what they give us and what they freely choose to give us when we have our conversations with them. And what we're doing then is we're trying to understand their constructions of their reality. And often, like you say, the problems come in where, and actually we can sort of sometimes unpick some of the issues, like you say, the fallacies or the inconsistencies, cognitive dissonance, for example. You can start to pick that out when someone's speaking because quite often they contradict themselves and often they're aware of that themselves and will say, oh, actually, that's a bit of a contradiction. And of course, when you read a paper, like our papers, you only see the tiniest slice of the conversations that we had because of the constraints of journal word counts, which are brutal for qualitative work. So whilst we try and convey as much as we possibly can of their constructed realities, it's really just this tiny little nuggets that we're able to actually print in the paper. So we use the academic space that we have as researchers to try and situate what our participants have said in the wider context. And we do try to be as fair as we can to our participants because often we actually fundamentally disagree with a lot of what they say. But it's so important for us to mitigate that and to address and understand and position ourselves as listeners.
Yeah, and for me personally, I find it difficult because I was saying to Carol this morning, I find like the labels associated with epistemology really binding. Like I don't quite agree with this position, I'm not fully into this position, but I agree with parts of it and things like that. So I think that's always a really hard balance to kind of navigate in your research because on the one hand, we want to be really respectful of our participants and, you know, we're not interested in saying you're right, you're wrong. We're interested in hearing their perspective so that we can use that knowledge to then, maybe influence other people's perspectives in a positive way in terms of, you know, making a more compassionate world. But yeah, it's a really tricky tightrope to walk, if you like, because yes, I think, well, I'm not sure I might be making assumptions, but on one hand, or I'll speak for myself. on the one hand, like I do believe in an objective reality, you know, I do believe that, just to bring it back to animals, because that's really all I care about. Well, when I say animals, I include humans in that as well. I care about sentient beings, you know, I agree with this sentientism worldview. But on the one hand, like there has to be this sense of objective reality because that's kind of where all the evidence says that, you know, these animals do feel pain, and we kind of need this evidence and this understanding of an objective reality because, you know, or else, you know, what do we have? We don't have any evidence base to go off of. But yeah, on the other hand, I do believe that a large part of this reality is sort of constructed through our subjective experiences. So I don't know if that makes me like a critical realist or it's just I find the labels extremely binding.
See, I'm the opposite because I'm completely social constructionist. Like there's nothing I know that I haven't been taught or learned. Everything in the entire world, as far as I'm concerned, only makes sense to me because someone else has explained it to me at some point. I only have words to understand, or to be able to articulate. And I only have words to label things with, which are arbitrary labels, really. But so for me, everything's symbolic and everything is socially constructed. I don't believe there's any knowledge that hasn't been mediated, or for me anyway, that hasn't been mediated through human interaction. So I'm really comfortable with social constructionism. That's 100% where I am. I respect other people have different views, and that's great. But I'm really comfortable in that place. That works for me.
But then how can we ever know, for example, that animals do feel pain and they do suffer? How can that be something that we can be said to know and to impart that knowledge on others? Like, how can I, as an advocate, then say to other people, like, well, here's the evidence, if they're going to come back to me and say, well, you learned that through a human who's using their subjective experience. This is a challenge, isn't it?
Yes.
This is why we're
it's about knowledge construction, isn't it? So, if we consider that, we are constructing knowledge, and the knowledge that we construct actually excludes animals.
Yeah.
We don't include them in our knowledge production.
Not necessarily.
So we have to represent animals as we construct knowledge, because we can't add them in, because we can't access their perspectives in any meaningful way that we can represent, right? We have to assume that we as humans can actively represent, advocate for, and even be activist for animals. But those are assumptions.
Exactly, and that's the problem, right? That's why so many people don't include animals in their moral circles, because we don't have that insight that we might have of a human perspective.
Yeah.
So that's why they tend to be excluded from the construction process. And I guess the way I try and amateurishly resolve that stuff, one is by giving up on an idea of knowledge and belief, and instead thinking about credences and probabilistic belief. So, it's about how confident am I that this is true? It might be true, it might not. Partly because I don't think we can, outside of formal systems, we can ever be 100% sure of anything, really. It's all uncertain because we're sort of evolved apes staggering around trying to understand reality, right? So why would we ever have perfect knowledge? But also because once you're thinking about credences and probabilities, it's much easier to shift those as the evidence changes as well. So I think that approach is absolutely essential to a naturalistic understanding, that evidence, that doubt, that humility. We were talking about that willingness to be shunt your views around based on the evidence. And because I have a very naturalistic view, I think that subjective perspectives are actually part of that objective reality as well, because I think my subjective perspective, it may at the moment be very hard for you to access that apart from my reports of it, right? Until we get some crazy futuristic fMRI scanner that enables you to emulate what it's like to be Jamie, right? But in the meantime, the neurons firing and the chemicals going off, those are physical, real things that are actually happening in the objective world. I don't think it's some magic separate subjective world. I think my subjectivity is part of our shared reality. So descriptively, I think that social constructivism works really well as a description of how human knowledge is formed in our brains, because we have senses, there are photons coming in, there's sound waves coming in, we're talking to people, we're interacting, we're forming beliefs through those senses and through our social interaction. Descriptively, I don't think it could be anything else. But I do think those signals, the social signals and our senses, have a decent correlation with a reality that is out there. So I think the fact that my eyes are detecting, photons bouncing off this mug gives me a pretty high confidence that mug actually does exist. And I could be wrong. Again, I could be a brain in a vat. But I think through that social construction and through my sensations, that gives me at least a probabilistic confidence that you exist and the world is out there. And it also gives me a confidence that your subjectivity will have enough overlap with mine that we might collaborate and work together and have some shared uncertain understanding of the reality we share. Because my worry is if you go too far down the relativistic position, there's a risk that each individual can almost arbitrarily decide their own reality. And some people frankly do that, and it can lead to terrible things. And if I was in a conversation with someone who was, I don't know if you've heard about the news story recently of this guy who was running a cult in Kenya, where he's convinced hundreds of people to go into the forest and essentially starve themselves to death to achieve salvation and go to heaven. Right now, if I was in a conversation with someone who's deciding whether or not to go into the forest, they might have this view that this guy is telling the truth because it's his truth, right? It's socially constructed. It's what he believes. And I just have my view, which is socially constructed in a different way, which is don't go into the forest. Please don't go into the forest, right? And I don't think that's just an arbitrary difference of opinion. I think I'm more likely to be right than the guy in the woods, right? And I think I could demonstrate that in a lot of different ways that wouldn't be perfect, but they are indicative of the fact that on that topic, I think I've got a better understanding of reality than the guy in the woods, and you shouldn't go after him. Does that make a sense? That's why I'm worried about it being too almost solipsistic, where, you know, I am me and my subjectivity is isolated from the world and it is a totally independent thing, which I know isn't what you mean, Carol, because the social construction puts us in these webs of understanding. But
yeah, so the webs of understanding is an interesting point, actually, because, I mean, just because we have subjective understandings doesn't mean that we can't have consensus. So we can still have consensus in subjectivity or in social constructionism. And actually, that's how ideologies are created. Because in, you know, there's some theories in social psychology, social representation theory, for example, and the argument there is that the way we share our representations of things allow us to create consensus and shared social realities. So they're entirely constructed, they're socially constructed, but we share them. And often those are, like, for example, your mug. You know, if you take that mug into a concept where someone doesn't have drinking vessels, you know, and put that mug into that civilization, we don't know they're not going to use it for digging. It could equally be a digging tool. It doesn't mean it's a mug. The meaning doesn't reside in the object. The meaning is created by us. And I think we can have consensus on that too. So I don't think we have to have, it doesn't have to be fragmented. I think it can be cohesive for good and for bad. Because the ideologies can go, you know, either way.
that group might use the mug for digging, but they'd still agree there is a mug there. And they would still,
yes.
So there is still, and I guess that's the only other thing I'd add. Again, that's a brilliant point, because it's,
thank you.
yeah, that subjective focus doesn't mean you're isolated or you're solipsistic because of those connections, and we can form consensus. But I guess I would make the final point, which is forming consensus is different from being right or wrong. And I think even consensuses can still be demonstrably and clearly wrong, and we can show that through, you know, gathering evidence epistemologically and demonstrating it. So even an overwhelming consensus like fish can't suffer, for example, can still be wrong, because there is actually a reality, which is those fish are experiencing suffering, which we can only learn about through social construction, but does, I think, exist independent of us.
Yeah, that's the problem that I have with this view, is that, well, then how can we advocate for what we, I don't want to use the word know to be right, but you know what I mean?
We're confident.
For the moral thing, how can we, you know?
I think we have to accept that our knowledge is.
What do you mean by that?
There isn't, there, for me anyway, there is no one knowledge. There are knowledges.
Are those knowledges arbitrary because of the experiences of each individual? Are they, or can they be more or less grounded in some sort of truth or external reality? I agree there are different knowledges, but are we in a position of saying, you know, who am I to judge? That's your view, right? Because I think this is partly Devon's point. Morality really is about assessing whether other people have understood things well and whether they're judging things well. And I'm nervous about this approach where you say, well, that's you, this is me. I have no basis on which to challenge or criticize you, apart from the fact I just happen to have a different view, and it's a totally arbitrary thing. Whereas actually, I think it's more about, you know, here's the evidence about the external reality we share, which gives my view more force than yours, because I think you've understood things wrong or you've experienced things in a different way.
I guess I just see things more discursively perhaps than you do. So I don't see these things as being as isolated or as fragmented as you do. I mean, I would always argue that there are knowledges, there are truths, and there are realities. I don't think any one of them is singular. I think, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we're all just throwing darts at a spinning globe. I think in order to make any sort of meaningful change, and in order to function or to make a difference, which I think is what we're talking about, broadly speaking here.
Yeah, absolutely.
Then we have our beliefs and understandings, which we cling to dearly, and we have evidences and knowledges, and we believe certain things, right? But in order for us to convey that to other people, we potentially have to take at least a step into their knowledges
Absolutely,
and
yeah.
their realities and their truths, because otherwise we're just banging, together. So I always think it's to try and understand someone else's perspective and appreciate that for them, the knowledges and that they have are as valuable and valid, and for them grounded in perhaps knowledge and empiricism as well. It's just that perhaps, and this kind of feeds into conspiracy theories a little bit, it's that for some of us, we've had so many privileges and the ability to be taught how to ascertain quality sources, for example, how to manage critical thinking, how to be, to apply perhaps some sort of more objective reasoning rather than being driven perhaps by emotion. So we have been taught these things. We've had those privileges, and not everybody has.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that the need for that empathetic connection to others, even if we disagree in really deep, visceral ways, is important. But part of the reason it's important, and part of the reason we want to persuade them, is because we've had those privileges. We are actually doing better at epistemology, and we do understand reality better. And I want to hold on to that. So I want to keep the empathy and the understanding and the recognition of perspective without just losing the value and saying, well, their perspective is just as good as mine. I don't think that's what you're suggesting either, is it?
Well, to some extent, I think for them, yes. For them,
yes, but they're wrong, right? They are wrong. The guy taking the people into the woods in Kenya is wrong, right? He's wrong. And the people who think animals can't feel pain, they are wrong, right? And I'm quite comfortable saying that with a very high degree of confidence.
Yeah.
And I can understand why they might have come to think those things.
Yeah.
But I can also have an evidence base that gives me pretty good confidence that I know better than they do.
But I mean, I've never met a vegan yet who doesn't have quite an inquiring mind. And I think, so we've done little bits and pockets of work looking at what makes vegans vegan, what makes vegans stay vegan. We haven't published any of it, but, there's been lots of sort of little things we've done. And one of the things that we find, which is a really nice finding, is that people who are long-term vegan are much more comfortable being in problematic social spaces. They're much more accustomed to being non-conformist, perhaps. They're much more used to being the different in a group. They're much less likely to feel the need to conform to social norms and all of these things. So
they're more comfortable actually challenging other people's realities as well.
Yeah. So, from that perspective, we are kind of occupying a slightly different space, and it helps us to be able to challenge maybe, whereas other people maybe are often a lot less comfortable with change. People who've grown up on, meat and dairy, they don't want to change. They like it. Well, I mean, I liked it too, but, at a certain point for me, what I like and what is right for me became, impossible to continue doing. But for other people, they don't want to have to think about it.
Yeah. Let's come on to that second question, because I could talk about this epistemology stuff all day, but it runs through the whole conversation in a way, because for me, it underpins a lot of the moral questions too. And this second question, I guess, is about what matters and who matters. And so again, it would be interesting to go around the table briefly and to get your story on that, which you've hinted at already. That can be about, again, how you grew up originally thinking about good and bad and right and wrong. What do those terms even mean? But also, how did your moral scope change? And, the classic story is family, friends, those around you, thinking about humanity, and then that critical point of starting to think about non-human animals seriously. So I don't know, Maja, did you want to start and tell a bit more of the story first?
I think my first instinct would almost be to say that everything matters. And you might call that a bit more of a radical ecocentrist perspective, right? But I do think that everything has a worth on its own, and at the very least, it might have a worth because it matters in one way or another to sentient beings. And I think that's maybe where we need to be a bit more pragmatic and prioritize the needs of the more sentient beings among us over non-sentient things, plants or rocks or whatever like that. And personally, I think I had this realization when my family eats horse meat, right? So, that is the reason that I went vegetarian, because I used to have a horse at the time, and I saw my family eat horse meat. And I've never actually eaten it myself, because I always looked at it thinking like, this could be my horse's sister or brother.
Yeah, you made that connection. Yeah.
Exactly. So, sorry, so that's what happened to me then. And that's when I started to question everything. So if it's horses that I don't want to eat, then it's cows, then it's, many, many other animals. So yeah, but definitely looking more into your perspective as well, and the whole sentientism thing. It was actually something that Carol brought up whilst we were writing our paper, because we did have participants express a lot that they felt comfortable eating fish because they don't think that fish perceive pain. It's a common thing, right? Fish don't feel anything. And I remember Carol bringing it up then, and there were many other arguments that people made as well about other cognitive abilities and intelligence. So we ended up not including sentientism, because I'm sure you would agree that the research is also still a bit sparse on that. It is such an interesting point, and I think speaking to you now, it's definitely shifting my perspective a bit as well. But then at the same time, I'm not one of the vegans that feels comfortable eating oysters, for example. Right? So there's still a barrier in my head where I give all animals a different moral regard, which also may not be entirely logical, but yeah.
And what's the motivation for that? Because it's possible that the original trigger around the horse meat could have been a disgust thing, or it could have been linked to the specific relationship you had with the horse that was your companion, or the broadening out could have been because you're considering their perspective. Again, going back to this idea of subjectivity, you're imagining what it's like to be them and having a concern for that. Why do you care about oysters and fishes and pigs and dogs? And
yeah, I think for me it was the suffering of my horse that I was imagining first and foremost, but I don't think that I would have made that connection without that social proximity to my horse, which again comes up in our paper. I'm not just trying to plug this, it's just obviously my own experience. So I think it was first and foremost the suffering that I was imagining from their point of view.
Yeah, thank you.
Trying to tap into what that must be like for my horse. And then obviously animals share many similarities in many ways. And the more I informed myself, the bigger and bigger my moral circle just became. And for me, interestingly, I think it definitely started with me having more concern for animals at first, and actually having, I don't want to say a dislike towards humans, but I think when you become vegan, it's very common to go through the phase of judging people who are not vegan and being very mad, that people are still continuing to eat animals. But as I went on in life, veganism actually brought me to also consider humans more and to see how everything is interrelated, and to understand that a working class mother of 5 children who's just trying to get food on the table might not be thinking of the cows when she's, she might have more important things on her mind to her right now.
And the ecocentrism is interesting because some people will put on a scale of anthropocentrism focused on humans, sentiocentrism, including all sentient beings, biocentrism, where you start to include, plants and fungi and things that most people think aren't sentient but are living, and then ecocentrism, which goes to rocks, rivers, trees, ecosystems, and so on. And as you hint at a difference there, because with some people they'll say, look, that rock or that river is intrinsically morally valuable. Even if no sentient beings are harmed, it's wrong to break that rock or to pull the twig off the tree or whatever. And other people, and I'm more in this camp, a bit more instrumental, where I have that rich environmental and ecocentric concern, because all of that stuff is really important to the quadrillions of sentient beings on the planet. And in a way, you could say, well, does it really matter if it's intrinsic or instrumental? Because we can still have a motivation to care about those things and have a rich environmental concern as well. But yeah, thank you. How about you, Carol? What was your journey on sort of moral scope, and how do you set it at the moment?
Well, I mean, I went straight to vegan. And I became vegan kind of out of spite, really.
You're the first person I've heard who said that.
Yeah, well,
that's a new motivation.
It was a bit odd, really. I knew someone who was promoting a cleanse, and it was targeting sort of vulnerable young mums, and it was a weight loss thing, and it was, it was kind of £100 or something for this aloe vera juice, and I just thought it was ridiculous, and I got a bit cross about it. So I decided
It's their
to...
reality, though.
Well, absolutely.
It's true in their reality.
Absolutely.
Who are we to judge whether the detox cleanse was really going to save them?
I still think we can challenge other people's realities.
Yeah.
You know, I think that's okay as long as we're respectful. So I decided to do my own cleanse, which is not a thing, obviously. That's what your body does naturally. That's what your liver and kidneys are for. So, and I cut out for a week in the first instance, caffeine, gluten, all animal products, sugar, and alcohol. And I ate like that for a week. And
Sounds fun.
the first few days were horrible. I had a headache in my legs. By day, it was horrible. By day 4, though, I felt really good. I thought, oh, I'm going to do this for a month. So I did it for a whole month. And at the end of the month, I sort of reevaluated, you know, and I realized just how much cognitive dissonance I had lost, or had resolved, should I say. I just felt so much lighter. I felt so much happier. And I just realized how much I've been dumbing down my own internal conflict about eating animals. I didn't eat a lot of meat. I only ever ate very high quality, welfare sourced. I sold myself all the lie.
Source.
What everyone says. Yep, exactly.
Glad you called it a lie.
They're all still slaughtered. They all still want to live, right? But I sold myself all of the justifications that I hear other people make, and I totally understand why people say these things, because I did it too. And at the end, when I hadn't eaten any animal products for a month, I just felt so good. It just felt so, my head just felt in a really nice place. And I've never eaten an animal product ever since. But
you did go back to caffeine, alcohol, sugar.
Well, I don't have much sugar, and I don't have a lot of caffeine, to be fair. And I only
5 cups of tea this morning.
Yeah, but 3 of them were caffeine free.
Well, that's still 2 of caffeine.
Come on, I'm allowed some vices. I am allowed some vices. So I became vegan by accident, really. I didn't mean to be. I had never thought about doing it because I had a family, and you know, I just didn't think about it. And then I became vegan, and then I still cooked animal products for my family, because at this point it was all a bit radical and everyone was sort of a bit surprised. So was I, actually quite surprised. And then my husband became vegan, and then my youngest daughter's plant-based as well now. And yeah, so that's how it. And then I retrospectively learned a lot about what it means to be vegan, and a lot of the, you know, perspectives on it. And so I did it all really back to front, which anyone who knows me well won't not be surprised about. But then recently and Devon and I have been talking about this. I've been thinking about quite a lot of the inconsistencies. So, you know, I do everything I can to avoid anything to do with exploitation or commodification of animals, as much as I possibly can. But, you know, I've been some really interesting talks about insects, and I've been thinking about, so for some vegans, you know, I mean, I don't get my nails done or anything, but, you know, like shellac that is in like nail, when you get your nails done, and silkworms, and bees, for instance. I know bees are not, I don't think bees are insects.
Yeah, they are.
Yeah.
Are they insects? Yeah. I'm not very clear on the
insects.
Sorry?
Flying insects, yeah.
Yeah, insects are quite specific. Anyway, doesn't matter. So I've been thinking about why as vegans, is it very common for people to say, oh no, most vegans will tell you they don't have honey, it's not ours to take, right? And maybe object to shellac from the lac bug in the nails, or not wearing silk because this is not ours to take, right? So, but why do we care about those creatures who we don't know are sentient, but we don't care about other insects?
But we do. Vegans care. I think vegans care about all insects, and they do their best within their abilities not to cause harm to any. Well, it's funny because I was going to say sentient being there, but as you quite rightly said, we're not actually sure. However, I suppose my view is it's always, if you don't know, if the evidence isn't there, it's always better to just be cautious about it. And I think vegans are really quite good at doing that, and just being cautious, because I probably shouldn't say why don't we care. I don't mean vegan specifically. I just mean, like, we don't tend to care about
for example, mosquitoes, we
that's
tend to,
true. That's very
a
true.
mosquito, it's a pest or
Put myself
or
in it, yeah.
ticks or lice or, all of these things. It's difficult, isn't it? Because then you think so I've been starting to think about how do we draw those boundaries and why have we prioritized some of those creatures over others? And I don't know the answer to that, but that's something I've been thinking about in terms of moral scope, partly because I've been thinking about farmed insects as a meat source and I know that lots of people eat bugs across the world. So I've been thinking about this and thinking about, obviously I would object to that. I'd object to insects being farmed for meat. But then I think also I feel a little bit conflicted about all of that. I haven't quite got my head into this yet, but this is where I'm at with my current moral development. I've been thinking a lot about insects.
Yeah, thank you.
I feel like we're all dying to say something on this. I can just tell all of us.
I know. I'm like, I'm ready. I'm ready.
Well, feel free to chip in. Devon, do you want to complete the picture on that?
Yes. I'm trying to get out what I was going to say to Carol.
Oh, yeah, feel free. Yeah, no, you can.
No, I was just going to quickly say, but I think, so I always think there is kind of clearer boundaries, whereas Carol tends to think they're more blurred. Because, for example, there's a good reason why I might not be as welcoming to a mosquito as I would be to another insect, because that's kind of self-defense.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like, I mean, I've got a very personal story because I got really sick with a mosquito-borne illness, but I suppose then that it would be more aligned with your kind of viewpoint that I don't view the mosquitoes as positively because I've had a bad experience with them. However, I do think that we can draw a line under sort of self-defense, but we'll shelf that for now. Yeah. Because it's so complex, but it's really interesting.
And I think it is different because I think there's a difference between moral consideration, where you say this being deserves moral consideration, just as a sort of raw material for our ethics. And then there's all sorts of other moral justifications we might find for how we treat them. And that could justify harming or killing. I mean, even with other humans, right? That's the case, right? And to my and that's partly the way I frame the sentientism idea, is that it doesn't tell us what the answer is to all the trolley problems. It says, but we have to have serious moral consideration for every sentient being. And to work out which beings are sentient, we should take a naturalistic approach, which is humble and prudent and follows the evidence where it might lead. And my understanding of the current evidence is actually very strong about fishes now, and increasingly strong about many of the insects and decapod crustaceans and cephalopods, and it's developing all the time. But if anything, it seems to go broader and broader. Right? I've not seen any research where it's gone, oh no, we found out this being isn't. And in a way, just to flip it around, I tend to think of this moral scope question of, if morality is about anything, for me, it's about whether and how we care about others. And for me, an other is a being that has their own perspective, their own values, their own interests, that can feel and experience. And in a way, that is what a sentient being is. It's a being that has its own perspective, its own subjectivity, and it might be very, very simple, but if it feels anything at all, they are an other. And I've never found a reason to exclude any of those valid others, any sentient being, from our moral consideration. Now, that still leaves open, what's the moral justification for killing a mosquito if it's trying to give you dengue fever or whatever it is, right? There's still loads of ethics to do, but the raw material is, we must at least consider them seriously as we're doing our ethical work. But yeah, I should let you answer your question.
No, I was just going to say, I think something to add to that, because it is really relevant to what you're saying, is I suppose mosquitoes do have a role in the larger ecosystem. They're playing their part. Like, every one of these actors is playing an integral part to the larger ecosystem that keeps it sustaining all life. So while I might not particularly have a love for mosquitoes, you're right, I would still consider them morally, and I would almost do it on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah, thank you. So what's your journey been through this moral scope question?
Yeah, actually quite different to Carol's, pretty much the opposite, because I very much became vegan and vegetarian and then vegan on purpose.
Which is why.
Yes, like most
intentional,
people.
Yeah.
Whereas Carol's latent ethics were sort of freed by a random spiteful reason.
Yeah. But yeah, it's a funny one for me. I don't want to sound arrogant in saying this, but I've just really always felt a huge pull towards non-human animals and a huge pull to advocate for them. So I grew up in a as you could say, normal meat-eating household. I still do. All my family are still eat animals, but from a very young age. Now, I have some memories of it, but also from what my parents tell me, that can match up with my memories. I just didn't want to eat animals. My dad would always say that I took the chicken out the sandwich and I would just eat the salad in the sandwich. And he's like, "Do you not like it?" And I was like, yeah, there was just something I couldn't articulate there. And I think that's funny because it's like, I don't believe, I'm quite naturalistic. I don't think I believe in sort of destiny or fate or any of those kind of things. However, like, the fact remains that I've just always felt this pull towards not harming animals. And it's funny because this happened at such a young age that I kind of expressed wanting to go vegetarian and things like that. But I didn't, not to my knowledge, I didn't learn it from anywhere. Like, my parents were never expressing these ideas. I never seen it expressed in school or anything like that. Like, I just always felt like I had this knowledge that they were just as important as us and they should be treated just as morally as us. But that led to me becoming a vegetarian at about 10 years old, I think, because I would have been vegetarian earlier, but I asked these questions at a very young age to my mum and dad, like, how do we get this beef? How do we get this chicken? And I mean, to be honest, they did lie about it. They were doing their best to protect me, so I'm absolutely not criticising them. But they did say that, we find the meat when the animal's already died naturally, and that sort of thing. So when I eventually found out that wasn't true, and the reason I found out that wasn't true is because I was actually really into like horses growing up, and yeah, the same
girls, yeah.
same as Maja, total horse girl. And I would spend all of my free time on this nearby farm and kind of hanging out the horses. We did ride them as well, and they also had cows on this farm. And myself and the other friends that I had on the farm, we loved just going and hanging out with the cows and just watching them interact and really seeing their individual personalities come through. And that's when I realised, like, oh, these are no different from my dog. And I don't think that was a conscious thought. It's just, I just knew they were full, complete beings. But we would watch, observe these cows. We would name them. My favourite cow was Janice. And they would lick our hands and stuff like that. And they were just lovely. They were really affectionate and, moody at times, and just really a full spectrum of emotions and things like that. But the point is that one day those cows were gone. They were not in the barn. Couldn't find them in the fields. And I asked the farmer, Jim, I said, so where's the cows gone? And he just told me, they're going to be made into hamburgers. And that's when, like, it really dawned on me. And you know what? I actually really appreciate him as an adult just being honest with me as a child, because I could take it. I really could take it. And I don't think we give kids enough credit for, I don't think we should necessarily shield them from the morality of things, as much as we do. Obviously, there has to be some extent of that, but definitely not when it comes to how we treat other sentient beings. So I really appreciate for him for telling me that, and that really started my journey of advocating quite strongly for non-human animals. And don't get me wrong, I care about humans too, but I kind of just
sentient too, yeah.
Exactly, yeah.
Some of us.
And some of it. But I guess I kind of just felt that humans already had enough people advocating for them. And this would have been back in I think it was 2010, round about 2011 when I went vegetarian. I just felt like there wasn't enough. And once enough been said about on behalf of these other animals. So yeah, I went vegetarian. And to be fair to my parents, they were pretty supportive of it, albeit a bit miffed that they had to make a second dinner. But they've came round to it now. But yeah, I guess and then I went vegan eventually when I found out about the dairy industry and that kind of thing. But yeah, I think I've just always been a fierce kind of advocate for non-humans, and that's where I feel called to advocate for. But of course, I do also really care about the ecosystem at large. and I would call myself an environmentalist, and I think that morally we need to take into consideration the whole ecosystem. However, my specific focus is on this, is on sentient beings, and specifically non-human animals.
Thank you. And it's interesting you said you didn't pick this sort of strong compassion for non-human sentient beings up from anywhere. No one taught it to you. And I wonder, I mean, you're the psychologist, whether the degree to which you think this is something that's just inherent in our human evolved psychology, because some of the psychologists I've talked to, and Matty Wilkes is one great example, he's done this sort of experimentation. There's not a suggestion that children are some sort of morally perfect beings that are then corrupted by society, but there's sort of something to that, right? Where young kids, before they really learn social norms, do have a cross-species compassion for other sentient beings, at least to some degree. If you, as the thought experiment goes, if you put a baby with a slice of apple and a pig, it will eat one and play with the other. So I don't know if you think that that's partly, where you got it from wasn't being taught it. It was just we have some sort of compassion hardware in our brains, and it was switched on, and then you just drove it through to the implications a bit more directly.
Yeah, and I think that's the case. And I'm not really sure what would switch it on in one child more than another. It could just be circumstances, because even though my parents didn't teach me, they were very open and we were quite privileged and things like that. So I knew that I could change my mind if I wanted to. Whereas I suppose for other kids, maybe they've got the same hard wiring, but they just don't have the circumstances to make that manifest. But I think there's a lot of, I don't want to say truth, but there's a lot of interesting aspects to that. What's a synonym for truth that's not quite as strong? There's a lot.
You're the English.
I think there's a lot to be said for the idea that we are born with a far more broad and a stronger sense of morality than we have as adults. And I think it just gets eroded over time as we're socialized into our social structures and things like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that's my impression. I've been doing more stuff in the UK education system recently. And the last guest I spoke to, which I haven't published yet, is with Zoe Weil, who runs the Institute for Humane Education. But from a lot of the people I talk to in the education space, there is this sense that, yes, we need to teach good epistemology, and we need to teach media literacy, and we need to teach critical thinking, and we need to teach compassion. But there's also this sense that we just need to stop doing the bad education that teaches broken epistemology and teaches people, brutally polarized ethics and teaches people anthropocentric ethics, right? We could do an enormous amount of value just by stopping the bad education, right? We don't necessarily need to do quite so much of the good education to offset what our social norms have done. But we should probably, given the time, come, because I could talk to you for all day, but I know you have dinner. The final big question is, given this context, right, we have our different ways of understanding reality. And I think all 3 or 4 of us share at least a sentiocentric compassion, and we might even go beyond that. Whereas most of humanity seems to be stuck in some sort of fairly brutal form of anthropocentrism. And some people, many humans, don't even go that far, right? It's about in-group humans, not even all humans. So we're in this weird position where humans basically have all the power. So human psychology is deeply important. And the sentientism worldview, in a way, focuses on some philosophical underpinnings and naturalistic epistemology and a sentiocentric compassion. But really, the hard work is actually in human psychology and sociology, which is why I find talking to psychologists fascinating. So I'm interested in how your insights into the subjective psychologies of other humans can help us actually make our collective world, if it exists, Carol, our collective world, our collective reality better for all sentient beings. And it might be useful to get into that by talking about the 2 papers I mentioned earlier on, the Pescetarian one and then the cheese paradox, because it feels to me on this moral scope question, it's not quite as simple as anthropocentrism, sentiocentrism, biocentrism, ecocentrism, because in a way, even the average default human today goes beyond anthropocentrism in some way, shape or form. Like most humans will care about some non-human animals in quite powerful ways. And they might be companion animals, or they might be charismatic wild animals. And they might not go much further than that. Farmed animals, liminal animals, animals free ranging in the wild, vermin. Most of the others might be excluded, but at least some are already included, even in the default human stance. So it's less about just simply going from anthropocentrism to sentiocentrism. It's making sure that sentiocentrism really is actually inclusive enough. And there are so many different barriers still to break through. If someone really cares about, Luna the puppy who's downstairs at the moment, right? Well done, right? You've gone beyond anthropocentrism, but there's so much more to do because we've been hinting at these things already, right? There's different species, there's different characteristics, there's different levels of cuteness, there's physical distance, there's evolutionary distance, there's difference. And then beyond the beings themselves, there's also the different modes of treatment and how they're treated and what treatment feels fair and ethical and what doesn't. And so there's so much more work that we've got to do. It's not about breaking out of anthropocentrism. It's actually filling out the sentiocentrism in a sufficiently rich way that everybody gets included. So I'll stop rambling on. But I wondered if the pescetarian one might be an interesting place to start because it drills into that selectivity that some human beings have. So I don't know if you wanted to sort of just give us a quick potted overview of that paper and the findings in it, Maja.
Yeah, for sure. I think that is why we decided to focus in on pescetarians because they do find themselves in such a gray zone of animal activism almost, because you can clearly see that many of them do very much care about animals and maybe more so than the average person. That's why they choose to not eat land animals. But then we were interested to explore what's the fundamental difference when it comes to marine animals and predominantly non-mammalian marine animals, because there we've got another distinction, obviously, where typically in the Western world, we don't tend to eat mammals for various reasons. And our research questions were basically to explore whether pescetarians experience cognitive dissonance, whether they feel this mental state of discomfort as they care about animals, but they also still contribute to their killing eventually. And then sort of what strategies humans use to rationalize and to alleviate this dissonance, to have a bit of more of a positive self-construct and to not question, like, am I a horrible human for contributing to animal suffering? And what I think we found, or our most significant takeaway, was basically that fish, so non-mammalian marine animals, again, a bit of a mouthful, they are spatially distant from us, right? We don't really share a common space with fish at all. And they are also very socially different to us. We don't really perceive similarities to them as much as we might do with land animals or even with mammalian marine animals, where we might adore dolphins or whales for how intelligent they are. We might go and watch them or swim with them on holiday or things like that. And
they come up above the water more often, so we can at least, that distance is temporarily closed. And yeah.
Exactly. So I do really think that our best way to advocate for all animals is to just increase our exposure for them and to try and tap into their realities as much as possible, to sort of have us cross over and to re-emphasize again that we share a world, we share an ecosystem.
No, that's brilliant. Thank you. And I guess part of that is to recognize that they do actually have a reality, which is the recognition of fish sentience in the first place. And one brilliant place I point people is to Jonathan Balcom's book, What a Fish Knows. I don't know if you've read it, but that blows many people's minds because, I think like most of us, we have quite a simplistic view of what life for a fish might be like. But when you actually get that exposure, even if it's through reading a book, again, you get this, they do have a perspective. They are sentient. There is something it's like to be fishes. And then the richness of that experience also is a sort of mind-blowing thing for people to break through as well. But that's a really interesting prescription, is that finding a way of, having exposure to the reality of the other. I mean, it's similar in some schools of intrahuman ethics, right? They talk about intergroup contact theory. That's a similar idea with humans, right? Just as you were saying, Carol, if you can really tap into the other's subjective and understand where they're coming from, that gives us a much better chance of empathy and compassion, and that applies across the species boundary. Thank you. So the other paper, the cheese paradox one, I think is also fascinating because that focuses on a different boundary. It's not a boundary of different species. It's actually a boundary within the treatment of one species. So yeah, I don't know if, Devon, you want to do a sort of similar thing with that paper and just frame why you thought it was an interesting question and what were the findings as you dug into it?
I mean, so the motivation for the paper was academic interest and also personal. I think from a personal point of view, just because I had made that transition, quite a profound transition myself between vegetarian and vegan, and because I was a vegetarian for many years before I went vegan. And for me, I realized that like they're often put together, or vegetarian, vegan, as if they're kind of one thing. But in my perspective, it was a totally huge transformation. Like my worldview exploded when I went vegan. It encompassed a lot more sort of big ideas and things to contend with than being a vegetarian did. So that was kind of my personal motivation for it.
It felt like a deeper philosophical shift. It was, yeah.
Absolutely. You're right, it was a philosophical shift rather than just, like, of course, going vegetarian was a moral shift, but it was more just to do with convenience and habit and things like that, whereas going vegan really just widened the scope for me. But I suppose the academic motivation for it was that all the papers sort of investigating the psychology of vegetarianism, they focused on why it is that vegetarians give up these products and they don't eat meat anymore. But I couldn't ever find any research on, well, how do they actually feel about the animal products that they do still eat? What's the relationship with those products like? And in our sample, of course, it's going to be different because people are vegetarian for different reasons and things like that. But in our sample, we did actually find a bit of a conflict about these animal products. A sort of cognitive dissonance we uncovered, that they felt uncomfortable about eating them. However, there was a lot of personal incentives for them to keep eating it. It was very convenient for them. It was easier in a social sense. And also they just really liked the taste, and they thought that they could get a lot of nutrition from it that they would struggle with on a plant-based diet. So they had their own valid reasons for still wanting to eat these products. But something really interesting that we uncovered was there was a distinction between the way that people felt about liquid milk, cow's milk, and cheese, which is essentially just a solidified form of cow's milk. So we kind of probed into that a little bit. And
yeah, that's a really interesting distinction.
It is, yeah. We sort of, obviously we don't have all the answers. We don't have the one knowledgeable truth to impart on anybody, but we postulated that because cheese it's transformed from the state that it came out of the cow is a liquid milk state, but it's completely transformed. It's a more abstract shape change. There's a lot of textural changes and things like that. And we think that allows people to kind of distance themselves from the morality of it. It allows them to distance themselves from the living animal that the product came from.
Through the additional processing steps.
Yeah, exactly. Because it's just a lot more an abstract of a product, So yeah, that was something really interesting we uncovered. But yeah, really we were just sort of aiming to find out how vegetarians feel about these products. And overall, I think it was quite surprising that our sample anyway had quite a high awareness of the problems, the environmental problems, the moral problems, especially with dairy and things like that. So I think that's definitely something that could be tapped into in the future.
And I found that fascinating in both papers, because maybe it's because I spend too much time on Twitter, but I expected more post-rationalization and more strident self-justification, both on epistemology and ethics. So I expected people to be more clear that, well, no, fish can't feel pain, or fish don't matter, or dairy farming can be done in a humane way, and that's where I get my dairy from. So I thought there'd be much more direct, clear, this is why I'm doing this. But actually there was an enormous richness of self-awareness about these conflicts and an honesty about them as well. People were acknowledging the real facts of the matter. Even in humane dairy, they go to the same slaughterhouses, and understanding the problems with practices of artificial insemination and calf separation and whatever it was, and similar issues in the treatment of fishes. There was actually quite a lot of honesty there, which again, in a way, brings back to what we talked about before, that it's not enough just to have good epistemology and well set up moral scope. There's still a load of psychology and subjective thinking and social stuff that's going on in between that and the choices we decide to take. There's been some themes about how we can make a better world there. I think early on we were talking about respecting the subjectivity of the other and genuinely want to understand where others have come from and not letting our own start to get in the way of that and becoming a blocker to our empathy, even if we disagree deeply with people. Maja, you talked about that exposure to others and genuinely tapping into their reaction, across the species boundary, but others, humans as well. What other thoughts would you have about generally how your findings and how your work give us hints about how to try and make a better world, given humans do have all the power? And that can be, it can be in the non-human animal space, but it could be anything as well. You can address it, sort of intra-human problems too. But any of you could sort of chip in with some closing thoughts before I let you go.
Yeah. Do you want to start? Or?
No,
I think for us, it was quite obvious that we do need the raised visibility and that we do need dialogue. Vegans with meat eaters, pescetarians with vegetarians, everyone with everyone, ideally. But something that came up in the paper as well is also a mistrust in the industry and the facts that we are being fed, and the images that are constructed about the dairy industry, the fishing industry, whatever it may be. So I do think we really need to approach this from a very broad intersectional perspective. I don't think it's for the individual to fix in that regard. I do think it's a systemic problem that will eventually, hopefully, bleed through to the masses. And maybe this is where the social constructionism comes in again, the us collectively building knowledge and reshaping how we perceive all animals or all sentient beings. So I do think we have a collective duty almost to get into dialogue and to try and change policies as well, based on evidence, right? Based on our naturalistic sort of information that we have.
Yeah, thank you. I love it. Yeah.
Yeah, I suppose you said something interesting, I suppose, a point where I would diverge on, or not diverge on, because I completely agree that at this systemic level, like policies and governments and things, we have to push for change at these levels. However, it's all well and good saying that, but actually getting it done is another matter, and it's really complex to enact change at that level, especially at the rates we need it in terms of climate change and stuff like that. So, I mean, personally, I have the view that we should all take this kind of moral responsibility for ourselves, because yes, corporations are, in the factory farms and stuff like that, they're the ones actually doing the damage. However, the consumers, the individual behavior is at the base of like the pyramids of society, and
we're funding it, we're voting for it, we're subsidizing it. Yeah.
Exactly. And if we removed our support for these things, like it would all topple like a house of cards. Like the exploitative industries would be no more because they wouldn't have a customer base. So I think in terms of how we make the world a better place, really take pride in your own advocacy and don't doubt the impact that you can have. It can be huge. Like I know myself, if like my parents have made huge changes and then they because of me advocate better for non-human animals, for the natural environment to their friends who then might, it's almost like, remember when someone gets COVID and we were all told that like if you then pass that on to them.
Social contagion.
Very exactly. Social
Just like
contagion.
a positive social contagion. Yeah.
Like that's exactly what happens with people being advocates and having good intentions. So I really think that it's like this butterfly effect. Honestly, we can make a huge change, and we should not underestimate the importance of individual action and behaviour. I think that's really how all change happens. It's just a group of individuals being passionate and steadfast in what they do and spreading the word and educating. And for me, that is the most important thing. I always find it really depressing when people say like, individual behavior doesn't matter. And I'm like, individual behavior is everything. Like, yes, it forms the collective, but we need to think about the parts that are making up the collective. So I very much.
And the institutions are made of individuals as well, right?
Exactly.
And there's only one group that is happy if we all sit here waiting for somebody else to do the institutional change, right?
Exactly.
And it's the people who are running the institutions and don't want them to change it.
Exactly. Yeah. So I'm just all for empowering people as advocates, or, just people who want to make changes in their own life. Don't feel pessimistic about the outcome of that. You are going to make a change. So yeah, that's my view on it.
Call to action. Thank you.
Yeah.
How about you, Carol? Any final thoughts about how to solve all the world's problems?
Yeah, well, I mean, single-handedly, obviously, I'm going to be able to do that.
Excellent, excellent.
So that's in safe hands. But being serious, I'm in a really privileged position, I think, because I'm an educator. I teach thousands of students every year, so I have some brilliant opportunities to start getting young people, and not just young people, actually, we have a range of students, but, primarily it's young people thinking about all of these bigger topics, like thinking about epistemology, like who is knowledge created for? Who does the knowledges that we create, who does it exclude? What are the injustices that our knowledge creation processes, systemically perpetuate? Things like even with the advent of AI, for example, we were talking to students about how to ethically use AI in their assignments, and we're making very clear that it holds systemic biases, and making sure that they understand that even a language model is inherently biased. The world's an unequal place.
Because we've trained it on humanity. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. There's so many pernicious power structures. And I think, I'm in a really good position that I get to have these conversations with young people. And I think partly maybe that's why I can be quite naive sometimes, because I spend so much time with, amazing young people like Devon and Maja, for example. I mean, they're just two of the examples of. But I mean, it makes me feel really confident for the future if we've got, magnificently talented and enthusiastic and passionate young people like Maja and Devon, who, really definitely want to make a difference and actually are equipped to do so because they've been trained in, critical thinking and, all these skills that they have, which they can then use to make a difference. So my small contribution, I think, is to try to open people's minds up to think about all these things, and then hopefully at a later point, they all start to make different choices. I mean, obviously, I don't teach veganism, and we talk about it sometimes if it's relevant. But I think it's the wider ideas about injustice and inequality and power and exploitation that I talk about in terms of people, and like racism, for example, or misogyny, or any of these social structures and oppressive systems. So that's I think where I hope that more education can be just a little bit disruptive of the institutions at large, and I think sort of tackling the way things are not the way things have to be. We can make, in fact, we have to make change. There's no way around that. We have to change. The world has to change. We're already on that page, and we're trying to drag people along with us. But ultimately, we don't know what the future holds. And actually, these conversations we're having now may well be moot because we're not able to sustain life in the way that we do currently. And then those changes are going to have to happen anyway. So
again, I think this is the power of the individual here, because without an education disruptor like Carol, for example, turning around and saying to myself and Maja, we had Carol as our supervisor in different classes, different years, but separately, having someone actually saying to you as a young person, yes, this matters. Yes, you should be talking about this, and yes, I will support you in this. That's something that I had never had in terms of my passion for non-human animal rights. It was always, I was always been told from professors, oh, don't be so biased and things like this. Whereas actually having someone like Carol saying to me for the first time, no, I think your point's very valid, and I think it's an important one. The power of just having one person to say to you, I'm behind you and I'm going to support you, especially someone who's in a position of power that can help you, that can elevate you. I mean, we wouldn't be sitting here, we wouldn't have these papers published without an educator like Carol. So again, it's just the power of the individual to make a ripple effect. And I think Carol's a really good example of that.
Thank you. One thing I do want to say, though, is there's this really pernicious idea that because we're vegans, we're biased. And that's
Yeah,
ridiculous.
being moral means you're biased. Caring means you're biased. It's like
Everyone's biased. Everyone has a bias. Me being vegan doesn't make me any more biased than it does that I'm a feminist.
Or that's not one of them either.
It's the same.
it's like saying someone who's invested in human rights is biased because they, it's like, well, you call that a bias if you like, but it's a positive moral stance, right? So yeah.
So this is one of the things that I'm really trying to undermine, I suppose, is this idea that, so in our work, we openly admit exactly who we are, where we come from, what we think, what we believe. Our participants know that from the outset. We're completely honest. And actually, I think that's why we got those really lovely insights, is because our participants knew they were talking to vegans. So they perhaps maybe took a step back from maybe a more glib response that they might give and thought, actually, maybe, I think maybe that helped them to maybe reveal a little bit more potentially, because they already knew that, you were in that position. But I think as vegans, we're saying, this is who we are. This is what we want to do. We're invested in. We say it in our cheese paradox. We want to achieve animal liberation. That's we know we're unlikely to see it in our lifetime, but that would be something that ultimately is a goal and an objective for us. But we're not going to be able to do that unless we respectfully engage with people who have different opinions. And anyone can read our papers, and they can read them through our eyes, if you like, because we've told them who we are, and then they can decide, well, actually, this is very biased, or this isn't very biased. And we go through a whole range of processes to try and mitigate against bias and to try and be as fair as we can to our participants, whom we value.
Yeah, and ultimately all we're trying to do here is to get people to live a more conscious life. Like, it really is that simple. Just not to live on autopilot, even though it's very tempting, because life is very difficult sometimes, and resorting to that autopilot, it's kind of a survival mechanism. However, if we can just live, each of us, a little bit more consciously and think about the consequences of our choices, and if the choices that we're making are going to have a negative impact, and if so, is that a necessary choice to make, or do we have another choice? So I think that's really at the heart of what we're trying to do with these two papers.
Yeah, brilliant. It's inspirational. Thank you. And one of the things that gives me hope is, in a way, we're not trying to persuade people to adopt different values. We're almost trying to persuade people to have the confidence to live in line with the values they already have when they really introspect. If they can free themselves enough from the social norms to think about, what they care about and the implications of their actions. So there's some hope there. There's a sort of latent ethic that, like you say, is sort of pressed down by the social norms and the powerful misinformation, disinformation, and other incentives that want to keep things moving. But there's a sort of trapped, latent, compassionate ethic there, I think, in nearly all humans that we can try and set free. But no, that was brilliant. Thank you for those closing comments. And I agree, right? We need the systemic change, but ultimately, even that's got to be driven by individuals. And to your point, Carol, I don't think your contribution is small at all. I think the role of an educator like you, who can not just send your own ripples out, but can influence thousands of students in positive ways like that can, again, give them confidence and free them up to be good people in the world, is inspirational. So thank you. It's been wonderful to talk to you all.
You too, Jamie.
Okay.
I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you so much for asking us.
So I don't know. I know you sort of have varied approaches to your social media and so on, and I can include links in the show notes if you're comfortable. But where would you point people if people want to sort of keep track of what you do and follow your work and support your academic and activist work? Maja, where would you point people?
So I'm not a very avid social media user by any means, but I have recently joined Twitter. So it's Maja _ Maja is spelled with a J. It's a weird German spelling, but Maja _ Cullen _ And I would just encourage people again to read our paper, Out of Sight, Out of Mind, How Pescetarians Manage Dissonance by Creating.
Distance.
It's working for us.
I know. But yeah, there's so much more in there that we just weren't able to touch on right now, that I think gives a more comprehensive view of what's going on in people's minds, and it's genuinely really, really interesting. So
it's well worth reading. It's not one just to read the abstract, because the quotes and the detail in there are really fascinating. And I think anyone who reads it who is a pescetarian they'll see themselves in there, right? And hopefully that will help with the ongoing process. So how about you, Devon?
For me, the best place is LinkedIn. I'm Devon Docherty on LinkedIn. I can give you the link. And in terms of my advocacy side, I would direct people to @EarthlingEd on Instagram, YouTube, Earthling Ed. I work with him and the Surge Activism team to produce educative content about animal rights. And I think that's the best place to go if people want more information about the sort of logical roots of veganism and all the big questions that people have about animal rights. That's where I would direct them to.
Awesome. And he's got a podcast and a YouTube that people actually listen to and watch, hasn't he? So
yes. A disclosure podcast, yes. But yeah, the YouTube's really great as well. But
yeah, it's really good. It's really good. One day I aspire to his audience, but maybe you three will help me get there. So, and how about you, Carol?
Yeah, so I'm fairly active on Twitter. I'm really interested in, like we talked about, conspiracy theories and lots of internet subcultures. So, part of sort of my research is spending a little bit of time sort of in informal netography and sort of being conversant in various different spaces, seeing how people argue, how they persuade, what they're persuaded by, things like that I find really interesting. So I'm fairly active on Twitter. Just at Dr. Carl Jasper, I think.
I think so.
I also have an Instagram sort of little family foodie inspo page. I'm a bit of a foodie, and that's the vegan food trainer. So that's just like pictures of nice food and getting people to think about, maybe making some changes to their diet by showing them how delicious vegan food can be.
Cool, lovely job. Well, like I say, it's been an inspiration and a real pleasure to dig into your research, but understand your philosophical journeys too. So thank you so much for being guests on Sentientism. Please do stay in touch, and I look forward to your future work too. So.
Oh, thank you so much, Jamie.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah. And it wasn't too scary interviewing three people at once in the end. So
yeah, well done. Yeah, credit to you.
We're quite smiley.
It was scary for me talking about epistemology. I was quite out of my depth in that first section, but
not at all.
You didn't show it.
Yeah,
well.
You held your own. I think you held your own against Carol's relativism.
I'm scared of death. I need to leave. I swear, epistemology, just have a mini heart attack every time I hear the word.
Evidence and reason. That's all we need. Evidence and reason. Broadly defined. Broadly defined. Well, brilliant. I will let you run. Thank you again so much. I'll speak to you soon.
Okay, take care, Jamie. Bye.